Hi, my name is Norene Roxbury and I'm a teacher at Otis College of Art and Design. Today we're going to talk about selecting, cutting, pinning, and sewing plush pile fabrics. Plush fabric comes in two different types, knitted back and woven back. If you would like a more firmly stuffed toy, woven fabric works really well that way, especially if you're going to add hardboard joints to move it. That's a great advantage. However, if you want a soft, floppy, and rounded toy, you probably want to use a knitted back, and most commercial plush toys are knitted back. Today we're going to be cutting out an arm for our little bear. Once you've chosen the plush for your animal, you want to trace the pattern onto the back side of your fabric with a waterproof marker or a very soft pencil. Now remember, you want to have the pile, that's the fur, the little hairs here, going in the direction that the pile on a natural animal would go. Think about your dog or cat at home. When you pet them, you would pet them from the neck down to the tail. You would pet the legs down from the hip to the sole of their feet. On the ears, it goes from the base of the head up to the top of the head. So you want to make sure that your ears lay this way, your legs this way. You'd pet down on the arms. If you find that you've cut your plush going the wrong direction, you're going to need to recut, because if it's going the wrong direction, he looks like he slept on it wrong. He got out of bed all scruffy. So there's a trick to cutting pile fabric. You want to insert your blade under the backing, parting the hairs of the plush as you go, keeping the back of the scissors right under the backing. And you'll see you have nice clean edges. Now, if you were to cut carelessly and just hack away at it, you would notice that you have balded the edges. See right there? It's all bald. You've cut too far in. And when you do your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to have a little gully of short hairs in there because you've balded the edge. Now that we're ready to begin pinning and sewing, there's a few tools that we need to use when sewing plush fabrics that one would not use when sewing non-pile fabrics. First, we use these really large 1 5/8 inch steel pins. These are the only pins that will hold up to the weight of the plush fabric without bending. Well, not bending much. Another tool we use for sweeping pile fabric into the seam allowance or to pick it back out of the seam allowance is a really large, heavy-duty upholstery needle. Another tool we use is very familiar. It's like a dog groomer's brush, only we use them much smaller. I use two different types. I use them with a handle for larger jobs and fingertip for smaller jobs. You'll notice that the tines are very tiny and bent at the tip, and this helps pick the fur back out of the seams that we've sewn. One of the tools that I just have learned I cannot sew plush without is a large hemostat. We use this for turning the sewn parts right side out and for fulling them after we've turned them. And another one is the little handheld nippers. We use these as we're taking the threads off the machine for cutting the threads and trimming. For most of the prototypes I use a regular home sewing machine. It's best to use a sturdy, all-metal machine meant for sewing denim and other heavy-duty fabrics. The new lightweight, inexpensive machines with the plastic pressure feet usually can't handle plush. At school we use a Bernina 1008, but a lot of the older all-metal machines do a great job. I've made samples on a 1950s Singer home machine that I bought on eBay, and it easily handles pile fabrics. Our standard seam allowance in the toy industry is 5 millimeters. However, if you're using a commercial pattern, the chances are your seam allowance will be either 1/4 of an inch or 3/8 of an inch. There's a couple of ways to manage the plush within the seam allowance. The easiest way is to sweep it into the seam allowance, like this. This allows you to see the raw edges as you're sewing, so you're not getting off on your seam allowance. In production, the operators don't use any pins when they're in manufacturing. However, in home sewing, and especially if you're new to sewing plush, you're going to want to use pins. We always start at the leading edge where we're going to start sewing. You insert the pin into the plush, rock it back, and insert it. You want to keep the heads at least 1/2 inch off the seam allowance so they don't get caught up in your pressure foot. Next, we pin at the end of the seam that we're going to sew. Again, pushing in and rocking back. Then we're going to look for any notches or notable curves. These little triangle outcroppings are notches, and we're going to put a pin in there to hold that exactly in place. Plush fabrics like velvets can creep or roll when you sew them. So we want to pin it so that we can make sure these edges stayed lined up. Now, we pin it on this side and you'll see it lays fairly flat. However, we sew it on this side. You can see that there's a little bit of curling and rippling here, and we can control this side because we can see it as it goes under the machine. If we were sewing from this side, you might have a tendency to sew some of these little rolls down because you can't see them. Okay, now we're ready to begin sewing. We're going to place the fabric sandwich under the pressure foot. On the newer machines, the zigzag pressure feet, when the needle is centered, if you line this up with the cut edge, you're going to have exactly 1/4 inch. How convenient. Now we're going to put the needle into the fabric, put the pressure foot down, and remove the first pin. Unlike dressmaker fabrics, you never sew over pins when you're sewing plush fabric unless you want to break a needle. Okay, to begin, we're going to begin sewing. We're going to sew, back tack, and continue sewing, keeping the pressure foot aligned with the raw edge. When we come to a pin, we remove it. Always stop when you're sewing plush with the needle in the down position if you can, so that it doesn't squeegee around when you start up again. And we continue. We get to the end, and we're going to back tack again and off the edge. Okay, another thing that a notch might match is an intersecting seam allowance. So you want to line this up and pin it. And I talked about the notable curves. This is a notable curve right here. So we're going to put our pin at the end of the seam that we're sewing. We're going to match up the notch with the seam allowance. And we're going to take these pesky curves and we're going to pin right in the center of the curve. And then we're going to put in any intermediate pins that we need to control the plush. So I'm going to put one right here. We're going to try and sweep that plush as best we can in there. And I'm going to put in another pin. If there's little wisps every once in a while, that's okay. After we've sewn our piece around, we're going to turn it. Now I've purposely left little bits of pieces out here so I can show you what happens. Okay, we're going to insert our hemostats, put our finger in between the tongs, and we're going to pull. This helps turn our fabric. And fulling, we're going to put our hemostat into the seam and we're just going to add pressure all the way around, and you can see it rounds out these seams nicely. Okay, and you'll notice that we have some fur caught in the seams. And this is where we're going to use our handy little fur picker brush, and we're going to go back in and we're going to use light upward strokes, and we're going to pick that fur right back out of the seams. Can't even see the seams now. Isn't that cool? Okay, now I switched to a more delicate plush, and I'm going to go back in gentle strokes with my fur picker brush. Now you can see I'm getting some of the plush in here, and I don't want to bulge my seam, so I can switch to a needle and just go in and gently pick the plush back out of the seam. After you've sewn your seam, you may find that you have a concentrated ridge of little short hairs in your seam. So that means you've done a really good job of pushing the pile up to the front. And on an even cut pile, this will show. So the way you control that is you go to the back of your seam, and you're going to take your needle and you're going to start pulling the pile out from the back of the seam. Gently, a few tufts at a time. You don't want to use the brush because the brush will start grabbing the back of the plush, backing and raveling it. So you just get in there with your needle. I know this is a pain, but it's well worth it because when you get back to the front of your seam, you don't see that ridge anymore. Sometimes if you've picked a large amount of the pile out of the seams, it causes the seams to become very loose, gappy, and wishy-washy. In this case, you're going to have to sew it again over the top of the original stitching. For your future seams, try sewing your first seam on the largest basting stitch, so it'll be easier to pull the plush out of your seams, and then go back and sew the second seam on a smaller stitch. Okay guys, I hope you've learned something today about how to select, cut, pin, and sew plush pile fabric. And I hope you have too.